Hi, and welcome to the U.S. Global Change Research Program's webinar series on climate, food, and culture hosted by the Social Science Coordinating Committee. My name is Ariella Zeikerman. I'm a program manager in the Climate Program Office at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, better known as NOAA. I'm also the co-chair of the USGCRP Social Science Coordinating Committee, and on behalf of the entire committee, we're so pleased to host this series and have you all with us. Next slide. So the U.S. Global Change Research Program began as a presidential initiative in 1989. It was mandated by Congress in the U.S. Global Change Research Act of 1990 to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. It's overseen by the Subcommittee on Global Change Research, composed of representatives from each of USGCRP's 13 federal member agencies. Next slide, please. The Social Science Coordinating Committee is one of multiple interagency working groups that support the USGCRP. The committee fosters the integration of methods, findings, and disciplinary perspectives on the social, behavioral, and economic sciences and interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches that incorporate those sciences into USGCRP activities. It serves as a social science resource to other USGCRP interagency working groups, the Subcommittee on Global Change Research, and other USGCRP activities such as the National Climate Assessment. The Food Culture and Climate webinar series is one effort by the committee to highlight the ways in which a wide variety of social science research considers climate change in a sociocultural context. It's also an attempt to draw attention to the humanistic frameworks that shape how we understand the complex and diverse ways individuals, households, and communities experience climate change. In this seminar of the series, we push that even further to see how these frameworks are used in practice. So in today's seminar, we'll have a moderated panel discussion followed by a short audience Q&A. And then we'll wrap it up with closing remarks from Amber Campbell of the Department of Agriculture. I'm going to pass the mic over for today's webinar to Dr. Bree Farber, a social scientist and contractor at the Department of Energy. Dr. Farber is also a member of the Social Science Coordinating Committee. So with that, I turn it over to you, Bree.
Thanks so much, Ariella, and thanks to everyone here. If we could go to the next slide. Great. So a little bit more on the context for how this webinar series evolved. We chose food as a focal topic for the series because of its universality. Food is something that everyone needs to survive. It is a human right. Its availability, producibility, consumability can be an indicator for human well-being, change, vulnerabilities, and inequalities. The impacts of climate on food, especially agriculture, are well documented, particularly in the natural and physical sciences. But food is not just a biological outcome. From production to consumption, food is embedded in sociocultural systems. It is representative of much more. So this series is building on past efforts by the USGCRP to understand how people are at the center of interactions between climate change and food. For example, the report that you see on your screen right now, Climate Change, Global Food Security in the U.S. Food System, unpacks how climate change already does and will continue to affect the availability and accessibility of food in a multitude of ways. So in this series, we've been digging deeper into the meaning of food by using a sociocultural lens and research methods that highlight the experiences of communities, their values, norms, attitudes, beliefs, lifeways, and the systems that shape and are shaped by them. This focus on meaning, experiences, and systems allows us to understand climate change at that human scale, what can be lost, why it matters, and to whom, but also how communities adapt and build resilience in the face of climate change. So while on one hand, the focus on food in this webinar series will offer real tangible understanding of food systems and their relationship to climate, through specific social science and practical examples, food in some ways is also a proxy. It's a cultural example for examining much larger questions about interconnected human experiences of climate change. Next slide, please. So on that note, This whole series has two guiding questions that center humans at the core of climate science. And those questions are on your screen. So what are examples of sociocultural practices and systems, and how are they impacted by climate change? How can sociocultural knowledge be applied to effectively build resilience to and adaptive management for climate change? Next slide, please. So you're in the third and final of the 3 seminars. You can see one that was focused on land-based and agricultural food systems, one on fisheries and coastal communities, and this final one, which is, as Ariella mentioned, on practical applications and applied research. Some themes that came out of the previous webinars are, we talked about the context and histories of what had disrupted our food systems, things like exploitation, settler colonialism, racism, policy that reinforces these structures and has influenced changes in farmer culture and practices. And we talked about the tension between a disconnecting global food system and place-based food systems that are grounded in traditional knowledges. But we didn't want to romanticize the local and regional food system, because that won't help necessarily, but we don't want to take away from its restorative potential in recovering some connections or relationships. And connection came up a lot. We talked about collective knowledge, including historic wisdom and collective imagining, relationships to land and place and being a part of place and therefore culture. And what will help, we talked about the need for imagination and being able to imagine that all members of our communities have access to whole and nutritious foods, talking about integrating traditional and new knowledges and practices, and developing interdisciplinary ways of working. So those recordings for all 3 webinars will be sent out together at the end of the series, so after this one, to everyone who registered, and will be featured on our website. Next slide, please. All right, and this is our lovely panel today. To start out with, we're going to ask each panelist to spend some time introducing who they are, what they do, what you're interested in, and also answering this initial starter question for us. From your perspective, what are intersections in relationships between climate, food, and culture? For example, how does understanding food and food systems and their role in larger cultural and environmental systems give us a better way to understand social dynamics related to climate change? So first up, we'll hear from Susan. We'll go to the next slide, please. Susan, I turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Susan Arum, and I'm the Executive Director of the Sustainable Iowa Land Trust. So we operate statewide here in Iowa. And this year we've launched a campaign to circle 10 Iowa cities with 10 permanent food farms in the next 10 years. In commodity states, you have to refer to table food when you're talking about farming, if you're not talking about what everybody's doing in Iowa, which is commodity crops. So you can learn more at silt.org, but I thought the best way to answer this is just to tell you a story about the couple of people I work with here in Iowa. I recently crossed paths with a leader in the Meskwaki Nation named Sandra, and Meskwakis own 8,000 acres near Tama here in eastern Iowa. Sandra had just quit running the food sovereignty program there when we'd had our first long phone call. She educated me about the Tribal Council, a colonial structure, she explained, implemented by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and not the way tribe leadership usually and naturally evolved historically. She taught me about enrolled Meskwakis whose fathers are Meskwaki, so they get annual payments from the casino and they get other rights that everyone else does not. Griped about the patriarchy and the favoritism of the Tribal Council. I can't wait to hear what James has to say about these things. And as she experienced it, especially when she tried to get more access to land to grow food for the settlement residents, and she was denied. So Sandra wanted to find land in northern Iowa because climate change was here, and she knew it. And her best hope of finding long-term food production would be north. She wanted to settle a group of disenfranchised women and children on that land and build a total immersion language program and a foraging program and teach the kids, about the old ways of surviving, because she figured that's what they're going to need in the times to come. To her, this was just common sense. She decided to wait until her son graduates high school, and because she realized that her Meskwaki friends weren't in a big rush to move so far from home. Now, Sandra's not the normal farmer that we work with, the average food producer in Iowa. The much more prevalent one is one like Rick, who farms in one of our western Iowa farms. He's the son of the largest commodity farmer in that county, but he came to Silt because he was, quote, tired of the middleman, and he wants to sell his beef directly to his consumers. He wants to go organic and sell organic beef because that's where the money is. A month ago, Rick took my coworker Joe and I out for a ride in his 4x4. He told us to bring the beer, so we did, and he showed off with pride the land that Silt owns that he's farming. He made sure it was all mowed and baled before we got there, and he had told us about his big plans to plant the whole thing to brome grass if he buys the place, because organic brome small bales go for $15 a pop. Brome is one of those tough grasses that cattlemen love because cattle can't kill it. The problem is neither can anything else. Once you have brome, that's all you have. So as far as I could tell, he was going to suck this farm dry. Taking bales off and not putting anything back on is not a good way, not a sustainable way to farm. He showed us other land that he owns, a lot of it pastured in a way that we would agree with, half eaten, and then the cows moved off. But he also showed us one of his 4 feedlots with about 100 head standing in their own muck, munching on grain and metal bins. We passed the family-owned grain elevator on the way to his office, which was this giant man cave of a place circa 1965. Dad walked out and greeted us. We walked down a hallway lined with old family portraits. Rick pointed out his kids. He was very proud that these kids had come back to run the business. Not many farm kids do that anymore. Of course, this is more business than farm. He showed us the machine shed where he has 2 full-time shifts. Two full shifts of mechanics full-time all season long for their equipment. And as we were riding back, drinking beer and bantering, I kept trying to find common ground with this guy. And I said, Rick, you're such a reliable organic farmer for us because you're not in it for some altruistic save the planet from climate change kind of reason. You're in it for the money. And he said, yeah, I don't believe in that climate change stuff. I mean, weather has always had its cycles. So as we stood by our vehicles at the Silt farm finishing our beer, he pointed out the field across the way that he owns. He pointed out another field that he's making an offer on. He's pretty much going to own everything around our farm. And my heart was just sinking. So we got back to talking business before we left, and I said, don't worry, I'll be sending you the termination of lease notice this week, which is standard practice in Iowa in August. And he said, oh, I know. When you farm 10,000 acres, you get about 20 or 30 of those every August. It's just business. So you see, Rick has no reason to believe in climate change because his business is so big and so wedded to the current system that he can't even see the impact of climate change on his or his kids' futures. The climate is so big that he can't imagine that anything he could do could impact it. And besides, it's always been that way. It's a trend. We've heard this before from farmers. And in his experience, whether or not he'd ever admit it, he knows the government will bail him out if things go south. That is the contradiction of small government Republican farmers like him, and they live with it quite comfortably. Sandra, on the other hand, sees climate change every year because one warm winter kills off her chance of feeding fruit to her neighbors, and one gully-washing rainstorm wipes out her hand-planted corn 2 weeks from harvest. Rick has crop insurance. Sandra has the local grocery store. Rick has debt-to-income ratios. Sandra has a monthly food budget. Rick's kids come back to the farm to run the business. Shelley's kid wants to save indigenous foodways. This is what we have in Iowa. We have a lot more Ricks than Sandras. What can researchers do to help us here? How can you quantify what's going on and make sense of it so policymakers will listen? Or can you? Maybe all we can do is show the industrial ag industry interests how much this is working against their interests. I don't know. But Iowa will be where climate refugees move when California burns up and the East Coast drowns. So we better get a good look at it and get ahead of it, folks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Go to the next slide. Lauren, Next, we'll hear from Lauren Gentile from the Environmental Protection Agency. Lauren, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Bree. Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Gentile, and I am a geographer with the EPA, based right out of DC, and I work in the Climate Change Division in the Climate Science and Impacts branch. So my research interests tend to center primarily on the interactions between humans and their environment, which of course is very broad, but as a hazards geographer by training, I really like to apply a spatial and social science lens to the various work that I do, which is oftentimes looking at climate change impact analyses. And it can be through maps, it could be climate change indicators, different models, and other visualization tools. So I'm very much interested in the spatial aspects of everything. And I do work on a variety of different analytical efforts. So one of the big ones most recently is climate change impacts and risk analysis, known as the CIRA project at EPA. We have a wide variety of sectors that people can check out online, and it covers the gamut, everything from agriculture to wildfire to air quality to coasts to anything and everything in between. I also work a lot on the Climate Change Indicators project, which is a bit different. So the CIRA project focuses on projections, and the Indicators project focuses on observed trends. So basically looking at what has happened up till now and those patterns. So really being able to show, climate change is in fact happening now and not just something that is coming in the future. And then I also work from a communication standpoint. So I'm a co-leader for designing and building EPA's new climate change website. And I have a varied past and worked on a lot of different things, but I think I'll dive into that question that was posed. And I'm going to draw in this case from actually my previous work where I worked at NOAA as a contractor in the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. And so there's many different intersections, frankly, that we can see with the food and climate and culture. And I'm going to kind of take it from more of the cultural slant for the moment. And, we can get into food production and supply and distribution and all of that. And I think the other webinars probably covered that pretty well. So I'm going to sort of dive into it from more of the cultural side, much like Susan did, but from a fisheries perspective. So I worked and had the opportunity to work on a crew survey project about 4 years ago. And this was unique in the sense that only one other survey had ever been conducted, and the Northeast Center focused solely on understanding the crew that makes up the commercial fishing industry. And the crew survey, oftentimes in the past, had included components about captains, which is very traditional to do and makes sense because it's very, they're all registered, they all have licenses, they're very easy to track, if you will. Crew are not. Crew are transient by nature, and many of them don't live where they dock. They live in other areas, and very little is known about them as a community and a culture. Frankly, the average age of crew isn't even, in fact, well understood or known, or the demographics that make them up. Anything basic and fundamental, if you will, social science is lacking in that area or is not as well understood. So this survey was really meant to start to build up that foundational knowledge, because part of it is to truly understand what would be the impacts both from climate change, but also regulatory and management decisions, how that could affect fishing communities. And so I got to work on this survey, which was fantastic, was right out there going from Maine all the way down to North Carolina, and had the opportunity to literally talk with the fishermen and fisherwomen who worked in this area. And one of the things that perspective that they provided for us that was really helpful. So this was actually, I should say, a closed-ended survey. And that always presents limitations because everything's being quantified. But what was really great with these conversations is that the fishermen that we interviewed were more than willing to expand on their answers. So we got the, standard, multiple choice questions and such, but they felt it was imperative to actually share with us their perspectives. And so one of the questions we did have was about what kind of changes are you seeing in your environment, basically getting at that idea of climate change. And what they told us is that many of them, much like Susan was getting at with some of the farmers in Iowa, they don't believe in climate change per se. It's weather. It's, we see this, it comes and goes, it comes in cycles. Many of them believe that, but yet they are very cognizant that there are changes that they are having to adapt to. And so one of the aspects I think to this question is that there are linkages to understanding the folks that are actually directly involved in these areas, in these food systems, that they can provide insight that we otherwise perhaps wouldn't really understand. And it also can give us insight into how, whether they believe in it or not is another question, but I think it gives us an opportunity to perhaps better communicate the information regarding climate change, make it reasonable, make it applicable to these individuals. And I would also say that another aspect of this is that these fishermen see themselves as serving their community. So there's a big cultural identification with fishing communities. And many of them are multi-generational. It is passed down from family to family over and over again. And one of the things we're seeing a shifting in is that not only do they have this identity, but they're also in some ways going through really intense decisions, because what was economically viable in the past is less so now. Many of them have to fish farther out. Many of them are saying, don't go into this field. You're not going to last. You're not going to be able to survive. There's too many changes in the environment. There's too many regulations that's making it very difficult for us to operate successfully anymore. So again, I'm running out of time here, but just to close the loop on that, I would say that understanding that cultural basis from which these various groups are operating is essential, not only to be able to properly communicate climate change information, perhaps build rapport and understanding, make that sort of connection in a way that they can understand, but also insight into how they fill and what role they play within the larger food systems and climate change that's occurring. I'll pass it off now.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It was a great story and illustration of a lot of what we'll dig into. So if we could have the next slide, please. Next, we'll get to hear from Natalia Pinzon-Jimenez. Natalia, I know you are having a bit of internet instability, but hopefully we have you. We have you on the line?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. I'm Natalia, and I'm at UC Davis and with Farmer Campus. And at UC Davis, I'm focusing on the wildfire adaptation of small-scale and family farms in California and how they're being impacted by wildfires. And I use participatory action research in my research through UC. I also work with Latinx farmers and farm workers, as well as small-scale farmers and family farms. And then with Farmer Campus, we do online education for family farms around organic seed production, wildfires education, climate change adaptation, and financial resilience. In this question around climate, culture, and food, where those intersections are, what it brings me to contemplate is how to be producing food in late capitalism, where we are pushing forward the agenda of overproduction and consumption in all aspects of our capitalist society, where these feed the world narratives are really predominate some of the climate change narratives that we're seeing in agriculture. And these narratives then support these food security and feed the world narratives support this technification and financialization of our global food system. It kind of sets the stage for what Susan and Lauren were sharing around getting big or getting out, and farmers, small and family farmers, getting squeezed to the sidelines and creating cycles of dependency and cycles of debt in small and family farms. So the examples that where I'm seeing this really happening is in wildfires in California. And so to give you a little bit of the context in California, where the region I've been working with in Northern California, we've had consecutive wildfires year after year since 2017 in the Sonoma region. Then we had COVID, we've had almost 2 years of COVID, during which we had the 2020 biggest wildfire catastrophe on record in recorded history in the West. And now we're in a drought, in a historic drought year. So all of these kind of crises and in and pushes on our family farms are being added to by the urbanization that we're seeing in California, where development and urbanization then pushes into agricultural land, and agricultural land is exceedingly expensive. So what do small and medium-sized family farms have to do? They then farm on the fringes in the wildfire urban interface, the wildland urban interface, where we have the highest risk of wildfires. So dealing with these multiple catastrophes on top of being in regions that are increasingly at risk to wildfire kind of sets this context for what we're seeing in California, where during the wildfires, small and medium-sized family farms who are feeding us in our regional and local food systems are the most impacted during wildfires. Not to mention farm workers, which I'll get into later. But these farms, when we've been working with them, we're finding that rural communities during the fires are the last priority, that they have the least resources and they're the least served. And these top-down linear models of support and aid aren't really reaching small-scale farms. So in the example that Susan shared of Rick, where he knows government will bail him out, that is not what we're seeing in our small-scale farms during these catastrophes, because there aren't really the opportunities for bailout for these farmers that we're working with. And these are, again, farmers that are feeding us through our regional food systems, because even though California is the breadbasket of one of the breadbaskets of the country, if not the world, it is a lot of the large-scale agribusiness that is exporting our food, while the regional food systems, put it simply, are the ones that are feeding us. So what we found was really surprising. Over the last 5 years, we've seen these incredible mutual aid networks come together from within these regional food systems. They're farmer-based, grassroots mutual aid that sometimes include NGOs, but seldomly include government aid. And these are mutual aid networks that help farmers recover from a fire, distribute food, because if the food is not distributed or harvested in time, they'll lose their entire harvest and possibly their entire farm business. So quick food distribution is essential during these events. And we'll have that food distributed and then given to families who've lost their homes and have had to relocate. So there's that direct, equitable distribution of recovery, which we're not seeing happening from the top down. And so it's within these alternative food networks where these cultural relationships have been fostered through many years of creating alternative and direct food networks that mutual aid support was able to blossom. And I don't want to romanticize it, because it's also extremely hard and farmers are tired of having to constantly deal with these events. But it really brings me to contemplate how the globalized capitalist food system is wholly inadequate, and if not in direct conflict with these regional food systems that are trying to survive within a climate catastrophe, as we're seeing. And so it brings us to ask if another model is possible for our farmers in our region. I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Natalia. It's a great intro statement and an answer to the question. We go to the next slide, please. Our last panelist for the day is James Rattling Leaf. James, I will turn it over to you for your opening answer to the question and introduction.
Well, let me begin by introducing myself in my language, in my indigenous language. So we would say Taya Yahapi Leampituki Lilawashte Wachi Akapalo Washichia James Rattling Leaf Machapi Haisapaki Yanka Ochanku Hematahana Iha Chantena Pechisapalo. What I said was welcome to my presentation, my introduction. I am known as James Rowling Leaf. I'm from the Rosebud Sioux tribe here in South Dakota, but I live in the Black Hills of South Dakota as well, and I greet you from my heart with a handshake. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. Thank you to the organizers for my time and this time to talk about things I think that are important, and I'm really appreciative of the opening comments from my fellow panelists. Today, I chose the buffalo in my graphic here as one response to the question. and I also promoted this idea, this big Lakota, which is my tribe, again, Rosebud Sioux tribe, big concept called Wo Lakota, and this idea about promoting and returning to a Lakota way of life. And so I chosen the Tatanka, or the buffalo, because it's really the essence of our connection to food, reminder of our connection to the land and all those things around that. And if you know our history as Native people, the buffalo was almost eradicated by an intentional process to not only eradicate the buffalo, but eradicate indigenous people here in America. That's a tough history for a lot of people to hear. But today, we just celebrated Indigenous Day yesterday on Monday, October 11th. And a lot of times in my work, I find myself sort of reminding the people, no matter what audience it is, about our history and why that matters, but also the importance of our resilience as Indigenous people here today, here in America and around the world. I really have the great opportunity to work at many different scales. I have a global effort, national, regional, and local, all around climate. Climate's been one of the central efforts of my work. And so in doing that work, again, I've come across a lot of people, met a lot of organizations and a lot of cultures. And in doing that, in those intersections, a lot of learning has taken place for me. I find I'm very humbled by this work and treated as such. It's because it's a responsibility I think we all have as human beings. We just heard again yesterday, Biden again emphasized the importance of Indigenous people, not only of the climate, but also a recognition, acknowledgement of us that we still live today. Those are pronouncements and such, but we take those as important steps. Still, in terms of educating the general public about who we are and what we do and why that matters. I think the topic of food and climate is important. The idea of food sovereignty, you've heard that term already. We adhere to that as well. We've always recognized the connection between food and our culture. And now that we have to deal with the changing climate, it's more imperative that we work on things that regenerate not only our culture, but also the land, the environment, and all those things around that. And I think that's the great opportunity I think that we have today. The Tatanka is part of a whole new restoration process across the country where tribes, especially in the western part, they still have good land bases, are bringing back the buffalo or Tatanka to land. And what does that mean? Well, it means, first of all, it's restoring a connection that was lost by the tribes and by the federal policies when they almost eradicated the buffalo. It means that that we're getting a food source again that is healthy, and it is part of our way, and it's a reconnection again to the importance of our spirituality and why that Tatanka matters to us. It's all this idea of rebuilding a nation around these keystone aspects of who we are, and we're not the only tribe that's doing that. But the point again is that these things are happening. Food systems matter. Again, I would also make a point about the youth. Our fastest demographic in tribal nations is our youth. And I think when we think about programs and processes going forward, we always have to think about youth and what role the youth have. So we do that. And so I sort of wanted to also leave you with this before I'll stop. I have some great colleagues at the Northern Arizona University, and they came out with the State of Tribal and Climate Change. And I want to close with this acknowledgement. We acknowledge all Indigenous people across Turtle Island who have inhabited the lands currently known as United States of America since time immemorial. We honor their past, present, and future knowledges, cultures, and lifeways for tending and preserving Mother Earth. We extend gratitude to and honor all our human and non-human relatives and the land, plants, waters, and air. We honor and recognize all voices as our sisters and brothers, leadership, elders, youth fighting for the next 7 generations. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Wopila Tanka Chichapalo.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, James. We could take the slides down for now and have full panel up so we can see all of you. Wonderful. All right, so now we'll begin moving into a moderated portion of the Q&A. We have some kind of starter questions for our panelists to discuss together. And just a reminder to the audience, we will have time for questions. We may be able to do that kind of throughout, and we'll leave some time at the end. But if you see on the right-hand side of your screen for the webinar, there's a Q&A box, and there's the ability to vote for questions as well. So if there's a question you'd really like to see answered, please feel free to vote for that. So with that, let's kick it off. So we wanted to start talking about the scale and the scope of the work that you all are doing, because across the panel we have a really broad representation. We have people working at the international, national and federal, regional, state and local scales, and often simultaneously. And everyone here has really different vantage points in terms of the food system, whether it's land and agriculture, education and knowledge, federal policy and the multiple levels of that, multi-stakeholder coordination. So we have a really broad scope as well. So I just wanted to ask, maybe start asking Lauren, as someone who has worked in the field and these different levels of federal policy, as you were referring to in your intro statement, what are some of the limitations and advantages of working on these types of issues at these different scales?
Yeah, this is always a very good question and pretty much the bane of my existence, no matter where I work, because there are, benefits and drawbacks to all of it. But I'll start with the local, building off of what I just talked about in the intro, and then can give you more of a current perspective. But from the local, using that crew survey as an example, the ability to do that kind of work on these issues at that scale, that's where I would say the richest of information is going to come from. That's where you get the details. That's where you get the context. That's where you get most of the real insight, I would say, contextually. And that's also partly because you can do a lot with the primary research at that level. So to contrast that, in my current position, I work obviously at the national scale. So I work for EPA, I'm in Climate Change Division, and our work is prioritized to be national in focus. And so we rely heavily on secondary data and organizing our research and sort of investigations, if you will, into climate change impacts from that perspective. And so I would say broadly, when you look at scale and scope, you can get the rich contextual information at the local level, but again, that ends up being very place specific, and you can't generally make any, you can't really aggregate the information very well or give that generalized perspective that from a policy standpoint is likely going to want it from a national scale. But at the national level, you could do that using secondary data among other methods, but you missed out on the rich contextual information. So it ends up being almost like the cyclical issue that many, I know, researchers and people working in this field struggle with. But I think what you could take part to is that they are two sides of an important coin, and they balance one another. So you can pull that rich information from the local and regional scale, which is very applicable to those areas. But you can also do things at a national level to help guide larger policies. Now, there is that disconnect when you actually try to bridge between the local and the national level. And I think that's the interface many of us work in and is very challenging. And I don't think there's a clear-cut answer on how to approach that. But I would say in general, both sides are equally important. They both have their drawbacks, as I just mentioned, but they also both have their positives. And I think trying to figure out, perhaps from a larger moving forward perspective, thinking about how best to bridge those information together is probably really one of the big focus areas in research in general and moving forward, is that ability to bring the local and regional information along with the national, very broad, more policy focused perspectives. Bringing that together and stitching that together is probably a main area moving forward. But again, that's a challenge unto itself. So that's what I would say right off the bat, but I'm very curious to hear what others on the panel would say and add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. That is kind of the challenge of our time. And I think all of you will get to speak to that a little bit more. So maybe we can invite Susan, if you can share maybe from a bottom up trying to rebuild a local and regional food system, and how does that articulate or not at national or federal and international levels?
Well, I'll tell you, our friend Raj Patel calls Iowa a sacrifice state, and I think we are. I think the entire country has written off Iowa as an industrial, I call it, without any ethnic slur involved, an Asian toilet, because we ship all of our pork to China and Japan and we get all the poop. It stays here. And enough for equivalent to 134 million citizens, even though we only have 3.1 million people in the state. So I don't think, we don't, first of all, the country has given up on us. And second of all, our current state leadership, the trifecta in Des Moines, our state capital, is all pro-industrial ag. But even when it isn't one party, the other party is also bought into confined animal feeding operations and everything. Even when the other parties had the trifecta, they didn't change the landscape of Iowa in any significant way. It's just one might have more love than the other for the system. So trying to create local and regional food systems, I resisted it for a long time because as far as I was concerned, local foods was about rich white people wanting to eat organic. And until I understood through our efforts to make land affordable through permanent protection, and to me, that's just code for non-white people can access it, and working class white people can access it. Until I really started to think through the food system through that lens of economic justice. And then I realized we're not just talking about local food, we're talking about local food and hunger. And COVID made it very clear that the more local food we grow, the better quality food gets to the hungriest people. So they're not just eating long shelf life, salt and sugar infused foods that are increasing their obesity, et cetera, and only adding to so that whole kind of systemic connection I finally made. And then I could approach the local food movement with a little less disdain or cynicism and infuse it with whatever I could for social justice. But right now we see money pouring out of the federal government to help local and regional food systems. It's actually in the tagline of the Biden-Harris USDA emails, which just blows me away. So I'm going to milk that sucker for all it's worth. And if that means going over my state government to get to the feds, I'll do it. If that means complaining to the feds that their grant systems are too complicated and too short, or if it means stoking our local Department of Ag, because I know they got $100 million or $200 million in cash that they're sitting on, that's what I'll do. But I think that's the best we can do in the nonprofit world is to chase down the money wherever it happens to be and do what we can do on the ground with whoever's willing to work with us.
Yeah, that's great. That speaks to a lot of kind of the considerations for equity I'm hoping we're going to get to next, because that feels very potent. So thanks, Susan.
Well, bless you, Bree, but I don't agree with putting equity in its own question. I actually think it's in everything. But that's my old days as a union organizer and being the only white person in a room for 7 years, I guess. But yes, it's all in there. We'll get there. I know we will.
We will. And thank you for bringing equity into every single question. So I appreciate that as someone who also thinks we just need to integrate it. Natalia, I was wondering too, if you could speak to this issue of kind of scope and scale, since you're working with migrant farmers, and there's a necessity with crossing borders. And what is that revealing to you about climate change and other stressors? I know you were getting to talk about the mutual aid networks, that those were both restorative and challenging. Just kind of if you could expand that for a little bit.
Yes, definitely. I think starting with this term of the necessity of migration, I think is an important place to start, especially when it comes to agriculture. Myself being an immigrant from Colombia, from a war-stricken country, which the U.S. has meddled in, can very much relate to many of the migrant workers that I've interacted with, where immigration is a necessity from the condition of the countries that they're in, but is not. It is something that the United States has definitely played a part in, but it kind of, for me, in terms of agriculture, it makes me contemplate how in California and in many parts of our country, we depend on an extremely vulnerable workforce for agriculture to function, for agribusiness and industrial agriculture to function within a capitalist society. We need a vulnerable workforce. We need farm workers who are undocumented and will earn low wages, work intense hours, not receive government aid during disasters, as we've seen, and are able to work during harvests and don't have to work during or can migrate to the next part of the country, of the West, where they can keep moving as the harvests come. That requires a vulnerable workforce because nobody else would do that otherwise. So laying out that foundation is showing that there's a mutual need for a vulnerable workforce that we continue to extract and exploit. So I think in terms of working across scales, that's one aspect. But then we also have this aspect of that we've been talking about. I think Susan mentioned it a few times, where we have local food systems that are to feed our regional communities, right? Ideally, not just the white rich people, but our local communities and small farmers who aren't getting the aid that they deserve, that are actually being squeezed to the margins, and looking at how there's a shared struggle across the North and the South, that peasants in the South, while their struggle is perhaps much more violent, directly violent from war and hunger and poverty, there we see a shared struggle against a system that simply doesn't really support the production of food, because it's really hard to capitalize the production of food. And so creating regional, cross-regional spaces like La Via Campesina does, where we can talk to each other across the North and South and look at our shared struggle, might be one way forward, so that we can start to get out of this scales question, where we can be cross-scale and trans-scale to really look at what are the bigger systemic issues that we're really confronting here. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and then some. So I think this is pointing maybe to a specific question about equity that we can expand on throughout. But just all of you have referenced things already, like COVID-19, global pandemic. We can think about civil unrest as well. These acute, quote unquote, natural, truly unnatural disasters like the forest fires, flooding, drought, storms, all of these things. And I just wanted everyone to have the opportunity to talk about how this has impacted you, your work, the organizations and networks that you are in, and how is that revealing things about justice and equity specifically for you. And Lauren, I didn't know if you could possibly kick us off and talk about the executive orders and those kinds of things like Susan was mentioning. And
yeah, so equity, I think that has always been an aspect, I would say, for most social scientists. It's always one that's near and dear. That is not a new phrase. It is not a new issue. It is always something that's been embedded in everything that we do. But interestingly enough, it is one of those things that also, from getting more into that policy realm, we have those buzzwords that come and go, things that become in vogue. And I would say that now we have an administration that is in fact prioritizing equity and environmental justice in ways that we haven't necessarily had before. And the EOs really do, or executive orders, I should say, are in fact putting sort of that pen to paper and really trying to encourage at the federal level a true, real sort of deep thinking into what it is we do, how we do it, and the ways that we can actually integrate equity considerations and environmental justice in ways, again, that we really maybe haven't taken that kind of a close look before. I think there's always been elements of work at the federal level that has had that in it by the nature of the work they do, like the Office of Environmental Justice at EPA. That is not new. It has been there for decades. But now it's looking beyond just those traditional areas of work and thinking about how we can include that information across multiple areas and sectors. So, for example, we now within EPA have a multitude of equity working groups. So we're trying to communicate with one another to both understand what it is we're all doing within this sphere, but also thinking more strategically about how we could include equity information, whether it's in communication products that we're putting out. And we adjust tools. So EPA is doing a lot of work beyond EJ Screen on ways to include community-based information. New stuff came out. The flight tool, for example, just came out recently, and that includes that information. We also have other ones on power plants in neighboring communities. Again, it's putting an emphasis on this topic in ways that it hasn't before and bringing it to the forefront as a priority for both the agency and I would say for the federal government at large, putting these issues at the forefront. And I think that that is a major step forward. I think that's positive. But I also want to make, we want to make sure that people also understand that people have been working on this for a long time. And it is not new to us. And it is as important as it ever was. We're not just simply following the beat of a new administration per se, but we are leveraging that interest and that prioritization in a positive way. I'll leave it at that for the moment as a kickoff, and let's see what everyone else has to say, and I'll chime in some more.
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren. James, I was wondering if you could speak to this question as well, kind of speaking to Lauren's point that equity work has been happening, and I know you've been involved in that as well, with food sovereignty and things like that. So, good weigh in on
yeah.
And yeah.
Well, thank you for the question. Again, I would just sort of direct us again towards what's happening right now in Washington, D.C. I know colleagues of mine I was supposed to go. I couldn't go, but I was supposed to go. And so we're tribal leaders are in Washington, D.C. now and making their voices known all around this idea of equity and justice, and environmental justice. I do think that, as we go deeper into this issue of climate change and how we think about it, from our tribal perspective, I think it's important that with this new administration, and I'm glad that it's been brought up here again, that we have maybe some hope that it'll be a little bit better again, that this administration is going to recognize again our unique role as tribal nations in this country, and that all those federal programs, all those federal laws, those federal policies that were put in place to help address the inequities and the inequalities and so of things that we face as tribal nations will be addressed, and they'll be fully funded. I think that part of that also, as I look at it, is the role of education. I come from a tribal college university background. We have 38 tribal colleges across the country, and I see them as one of the key aspects to helping develop and lead a new generation of tribal leaders with an equity or social justice preparation. I think about then the role of traditional knowledges in all this work. I led off with the idea of Wolakota and those aspects. See, for us, it's not just the land; it's everything associated with the land. It's our identity. It's who we are as tribal nations, and really strengthening and rebuilding our land base and our environmental laws and our culture and education and our healthcare. The role of healthcare and the role of wellness is just as important as well. If we can have all these things, but if we're not healthy people, then it doesn't make no sense. But I do believe that there is a role for tribal nations in all this work. Bears Ears, for instance, was back to a national monument again. Well, how did that happen? Well, I would say a lot of the tribal nations had a major role in making that happen. And they're doing the work to research, doing the work to demonstrate the importance of that being a park again, and to keep out extractive technology and industry. So I think the challenge for us again is that with all these varied interests going forward, how do we work together? How do we build those partnerships that recognizes and respects each other's viewpoints? And from my point, it's always our knowledges. And again, I think that Mother Nature mirrors human nature. And we do talk about the land, we do talk about the water and agriculture and land. That's important. But I also think that there's a human dimension to this work that still needs to be addressed. Is how do we work with each other as human beings? How do we recognize each other? And so I think those are all big idea, or at least things that I think about when you talk about this big issue of equity. I think, as you know, if you follow the news, there's a lot of talk about reparations again. People are talking about how do we fix what happened in the past. So I work with a lot of those sort of aspects of it too, in terms of reconciliation. I always like to start with that conversation with reconciliation back to the land. We all have to do that. In particular, when tribal nations, have the opportunity again to reconnect with who we are again, based on our traditions, I think that helps all of us. And my last point would be is, if you follow climate change around the world as I do, in terms of conservation, again, there was big statements by world leaders talking about the importance of indigenous people and their knowledges. And so, if this is going to go forward, our voices need to be at the table. I used to always laugh at, that we need to be at the table. My friend gets mad at me and says, no, James, we need to burn down and chop down that table and we need a new table. So anyway, I'll stop there.
I love that, James. Can I add, Brianna, to what James just said? So I really hope that these federal resources do make it into the hands of the people who've been historically doing the work of tribal nations. It really, really, from the bottom of my heart, I hope that happens. From my vantage point in California and in working in agroecology throughout Latin America, through the Scientific Society of Agroecology of Latin America, I've seen that when there's federal and foundation resources available to support equity, agroecology, food sovereignty, the organizations that are staffed and have the grant writing finesse are often those that receive the funds, even if they haven't been historically doing the work. And this is extremely problematic. There's an alliance called the Heal Food Alliance, and they published a letter to the foundations in California condoning them for distributing funds to do research on BIPOC farmers by organizations that are white-led, when we know what BIPOC farmers need in order to be successful. We don't need more research, and we need the communities who are entrenched, who are in the trenches, and have been for many decades, and often as volunteers, to get access to these resources. So the challenge is how do we get those funds into the hands of the communities that are doing the work and have done the work historically?
Does anyone else have things that you wanted to address in this specific question? Not, I think Natalia gave us a great segue. So, and just a reminder to the audience, please feel free to use the Q&A. I see some folks have been using it, but if you have things for our panelists, please feel free to put your questions in there, and we will make sure to try to leave some time for that. So kind of on Natalia's point of how do we get the resources where they need to go. I'd like to turn this part, kind of this last half of our time together, to thinking about what is useful for all of you in your work and what is still needed. And we can talk about that from a couple of different vantage points. I'd like to start out with research directions, but we can also move into talking about the kinds of climate futures that we all want that are just and equitable and resilient. So here are some questions just to consider for us. As practitioners, you all have a really wide variety of professional and personal experiences. How does research get used in your work? How can researchers ensure their work is speaking to practitioner and community priorities? What gaps between food, culture, and climate research and/or practice are you seeing right now? And what might be able to bridge some of those gaps? So I'd like to start with Susan on this question about what is useful and potentially needed in terms of research for silt and more broadly climate resilient food systems.
Yeah, it's there's so much, we lost the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture here when the legislature rather gratuitously unfunded it after 30 years. And so we're missing a lot. Right now we try to use research that proves that small farms are as profitable as large ones, right? Which isn't very, but still, want to have them at the same on the same playing field, so to speak. That having a day job matters, and it always has. I understand there's some work out of Montana State from an economist there. We'd like to see research that shows what combination of wage work and farm work and at what scale can be sustainable for a single person, a couple, and a family. Because it's just so amorphous right now. Would love to see more about the gap. There's a big gap between climate research and food, of course. Climate news is just so overwhelming. It's so easy to shrug it off and leave it to the global companies to decide and let the big forces out there fight the giants, right? And just because they're the only ones who can make a real impact, right? Buying a Prius is not going to solve climate change. So, where does that leave us? Those of us in the middle trying to make a difference. There's a company out there called something like Ecotone. They're charging $30,000 to $60,000 to tell us what our ecological impact is on each of our farms. If we want to know if we plant, 1,000 trees along a waterway, how much reduction in nutrients that's going to be, and how much carbon is going to be sequestered, and if we run cattle through it, et cetera, et cetera. If we create a farm system, they're going to charge us basically more than we pay ourselves a year in salary to tell us what those impacts are. It would be really nice to have a public source to be able to plug in that math and figure out what they call it now ecological services or environmental services. When I was a union organizer, environmental services were the janitors. But so, what those are worth. And these granting agencies all want to know what our environmental impact will be. Well, only really wealthy nonprofits can tell you that. The rest of us are just guessing. Or we're trying to get information from Iowa State, God forbid. So, we really do need more help with that kind of information if we have to make the case to grantors or the public about our impact. I think that's probably where I should stop. There's plenty of others.
Great. Thanks, Susan. James, I was also wondering if you could speak about some of these priorities and gaps that you're seeing in your work. I know
we're getting close to the time for the start, and I recognize Jack.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this whole theme that I've been a part of of research. I think that I also work at the University of Colorado Boulder, so we've been on this pathway to really think deeply about how we do this. I know that in terms of research priorities, working in indigenous communities, that has to be aligned. I think that we have to grow and develop our capacity at tribal nations to do research and to be part of research projects. I think we have to look at the whole idea of data sovereignty when data is collected on ourselves, by ourselves, for ourselves. What's that look like? And how do we inform policy and laws that would strengthen our ability to regulate and monitor and mitigate our data? Finally, I would say again is the role of tribal college universities when it comes to research. We are a growing element of tribal education and self-determination. All those big concepts are embedded in what tribal college universities are. But there has to be a process and a partnership that makes sense, that deals with the priorities of tribal nations, what's important to them, and then come back and figure out if that's a good project or not. I do think that that we do have questions about things that we have concern about. But again, I think we also know the history of research, what's done to us, and so we're becoming increasingly aware and more sophisticated of how we deal with researchers, especially when it comes to science, data, and technology. So that I think we need an agenda. I think we need an agenda. I think we need a platform for collaboration again. We need a decision-making process that makes sense for all of us. Leadership all matters in this as well. What kind of leadership do we then do? So those are things that I think about, I work on right now, and certainly climate data is one of them. And we're looking forward to some things that we're starting here at the university that works specifically with tribal nations. And hopefully in a year or so we'll have something more in terms of substantial. But I go back to the fact that when it comes to needs and priorities, we have to figure out our next generation and how we support them. I think that's all our responsibility, because the problems aren't going away. As they say, they're very wicked problems, and so we need solutions that are wicked as well.
I love that. Wicked solutions. There's a really great question in the chat that feels really connected to what we're talking about right now. And I don't know, we lost video on James, but if the rest of you want to take a stab at this, I think that could be great to build off of, research directions and what is needed, what is working. Can you share some models of connecting research to Indigenous and regional knowledge that are well done? Have you all seen those kinds of models or examples of what might work? So,
I believe that participatory action research is a really good model for researchers working especially with communities like Latino communities, because it puts the outcomes of the research front and centered, and by having action be a necessary outcome of the research that is integrated with what the community needs. So the community needs are always prioritized. A little vignette connected to this is when I first started working with Latino farmers in the Salinas region of California. They told me, we're so tired of researchers coming in and telling us, asking us, what are your needs? What are your needs? And they come in these waves, they say, but we don't trust any of them because they never come back. We never get what we say our needs are. We never see those reciprocated to us. And then we see them having these illustrious careers. So there's this extractivism happening. So I think while it might not answer the question of what's a good model, I think it's an example of how to not do research within those communities requires deep trust and partnership, and bringing and having members from the community being research partners, being co-researchers, as is shown in participatory action research.
I think that's a great example, Natalia. So definitely showing the failures of some current research models, but how something like participatory action research done well and can fill in that gap. And Lauren, I didn't know if you wanted to weigh in on this question too.
Yeah, well, actually, two things. So to what Natalia just said, definitely agree 100% there, and that very much in fishing communities is very similar. You want those trusted gatekeepers who can really help you connect with the communities and also participate and provide that perspective. And we would get that question a lot with the crew survey, like, why should we talk to you? You're representing the federal government. You're just here to use this against us, or this, that, and the other. We'd get a wide range of things, or we keep telling you information, but we don't see anything come out of it. Where's the benefit to talking to you? Where's the change? Where's the improvements? So I think this is like a fundamental issue that's occurring in a lot of research, and one that you want to definitely, I agree, be very careful and again, there may not be a great model or a perfect one to point to, but I think there's a whole host of examples of what you should not do and what you don't want to do that could guide you. I think that can be just as informative. But back to a quick thing that James had mentioned a minute ago about sort of the climate data and research needs, and that's something I want to say that we definitely, I would say, are constantly thinking through at the federal level, and particularly in the climate change division. So for example, we actually just released a coworker and I had developed, along with contractor support, a big report on social vulnerability and climate change in the US, and that just got released last month. And it's one of the first sort of forays for the agency in looking at climate projections tied to who is vulnerable and how much. So we were really looking at the disproportionate impacts. So this isn't to say within the report that these groups that didn't rank as highly as you, if you will, or didn't statistically show as much impact. That's not what we're saying. We're just saying disproportionately relative to others, they're not quite as affected or as impacted. And it's sort of one of those nuances that gets challenging to communicate. But one of the things from a research perspective is how do we balance including that kind of fundamental information? Again, this is at the national, it's providing a national picture we haven't necessarily had with these climate projections and impacts, but done at, resolution is obviously at a local level. But where I'm going with it is sort of how do you balance that with what I would say is a very complex dynamic, and that is future behavior and human population change in the future. And so that's one thing we didn't get into because of a lot of various reasons. We wanted to really focus on those climate projections, so we held the population information constant to what we knew to be true right now, because it's so hard to predict. What would migration look like? How would the demographics change over time in different groups? And so that's just one thing I want to put out there as definitely a research need and challenge, is thinking through how we could maybe untangle some of that more future population information in a reasonable way. Again, it's super complex, and none of the models, gravity models and population projection information agrees on anything, but it's just something that we struggle with, and it's a limitation in the work that we can do reasonably well. But it's one I kind of want to throw out there as something that I would say is definitely a research need in the future, is how to have really good population information to bring together with the climate change projection information that is constantly evolving and advancing. Throw that out there.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Lauren. Those are some great examples and kind of the gaps and the needs that we need to address. We do, I think, need to move on to the next question fairly soon, the moderated question. But Susan, did you have models that came to mind of how to connect research to regional knowledge that are well done?
Yeah, well, like I said, Leopold Center at Iowa State used to provide that, but Ken Meter out of Crossroads Research, he comes in and he's an economist, and I'm not the biggest fan of economists, but they're starting to get it, and he's one of the ones who does. So he comes in and works with a municipality or a regional food system and helps provide the economic analysis of the difference between where the money goes in a commodity system versus where the money goes in a local food system. And you can see a lot more of the money staying in the food system. And when you get that from an economist, it just has more oomph, because you don't expect them to say that, because they never do. So that's one guy, in the Midwest who's doing good work that way. And he has a new book out as well, but I haven't read it yet. But other than that, I guess we've had anthropologists come through, but I don't know, the results of that work, quite honestly. I don't know if it's had the same impact.
Yeah, like we said, research doesn't always come back to the people who need it in meaningful ways. So I think I'd like to do the final kind of moderated portion of this. And again, it's looking it's asking that question, what is useful and what is needed, but thinking from a broader, more like what systemic level, thinking about our climate future together a little bit at the end here. So 2 questions to possibly get us started. How could insights from social science get us to culturally relevant, just, climate adaptive and resilient futures? And you all have been weighing in on this a little bit. If you have other things to expand on, what do social scientists and people using social science need to consider when they aim to create these types of futures? So, I don't know if Lauren, if you wanted to start off on that question.
Sure. Well, so combination of, I guess, answering both. Well, I mean, social science knowledge provides a multitude of insights, I would say, that are very important. In general, it can provide that sort of understanding of the dynamics, not just between humans and their environments, but the role humans play within the environment. So sort of twofold there. I would also say, like, again, from my perspective as a geographer and someone focused on climate change, it's insight into what I call the basic information, like who is actually being affected, how much are they being affected, in what way, because understanding things like the vulnerabilities that people have, their values, so getting back to sort of what we've talked about with differing perspectives, for example, on climate change, what's real, what's not, those values, etc., all of that can allow us to better, I would say, develop what I would hope to be more equitable and adaptive solutions, just because it's inherently understanding the people factor. It's understanding their behaviors. It's understanding what motivates them as well. And so I would say that that is a better way moving into that sort of climate future question about how to be able to develop these solutions in such a way that are equitable, that actually reach the people that need them the most, and can be effectively implemented. And I mean, this was going on in our chat here, but one I want to mention that what I thought was really important is that going back to that resources question, that's a big one moving forward in terms of this climate futures. And I would say that it's right on what they were saying in our chat in general is about, well, if the people that need it the most are the people that don't have that, grant writing expert on staff, don't have the time or, the knowledge of the ins and outs of a grant process and the time it takes to do it and what you got to do to check those boxes, it's really like it's ability to sell your project and your need. And that doesn't necessarily equate with what is actually happening on the ground. You could have a great need, but doesn't mean that you can very easily communicate it to a way that some person sitting in an office, potentially in DC or in the federal level, is going to be able to see or understand that, because again, and in all fairness on their end, they're getting countless grants coming across their desk. I mean, they're inundated. And so it's almost like you got to be sort of aware of this language to be able to properly insert it and get it to them so they understand it, so your application stands out at the top. And I think that this is just a bigger issue in general, and I know Natalia and Susan and James could weigh in on this, definitely being more boots on the ground than I am at this point, but that's just a perspective I wanted to add there, along with just that insight about who is vulnerable, what are the needs, etc. I think all of that is part of this sort of question about what is the future going to be. So I'd like to let them weigh in on this now.
I can chime in. I wanted to lead with an example of some of the experiences we've been seeing on the ground with farm workers in particular during wildfires, where during the wildfires we found that farm workers were really the absolutely most impacted. And because California depends on this vulnerable workforce that I was telling you earlier, there isn't really much support. And we found that farm workers were coming without personal protective equipment during extremely high pollution days, and they were farming on those days. And they were being woken up in the middle of the night to work in the vineyards. And when confronted about this, when we asked their employers, they wouldn't even let us approach the subject or meet with their farm workers and support them and distribute personal protective equipment, in part because they have relationships with the politicians, so they have a lot of power. So we're seeing that sometimes crops are treated as being more valuable than the humans that harvest them, and that farm workers can be dropped off in the middle of a field where they have no idea where they are, and a fire is coming, and they don't know which way to go, and they don't know where is safe because they're undocumented. So for me, it brings the question of resilience for whom and resilience for what, where we might create systems and policies that support the resilience of vineyards. What does that resilience really mean if it means the vulnerability of a workforce that the vineyards depend so much on? This concept of resilience has been heavily criticized for it supported the status quo. And if we are resilient to a deeply unjust and extractive system, why would we want to celebrate that? So asking resilience for whom really allows us to think beyond that. And we can instead start to think of a transformative resilience, which is maybe connected to what James's friend was saying about creating a new table or burning a table to create a new table, and what previous seminars here have talked about in terms of disrupting food systems is how can we create a transformative resilience where the systems and structures themselves are transformed to both reduce the risk and increase equity. And I think we're really grappling with that in the fires work, because it's one of the recommendations is to transform how we live in relationship to fire and transform our societies in response to the fires that we're seeing.
That is a great point, Natalia, on the resilience for whom and what are we making resilient in the first place. So thank you for that. Susan, I know if you wanted to also weigh in on the climate future.
It's just amazing how much organizing it takes to have a voice, right? I mean, as they used to say, democracy is not a spectator sport, but it's an immense amount of organizing. Natalia's working off of the farm workers union and all the work that's happened in the past, and it was power. It was a function of power that even got her and the position she's in and the center she works at. It's helping, and the marches on the streets last year were, everything we're seeing now is a function of that power. Status quo powerful people don't want to see that happening all the time. They have to do something about it. And here in Iowa, we have invisible farmers too. They tend to be white, but they're still invisible, because if you're not growing commodity crops, you're not a real farmer. You're a gardener. And I sometimes wonder how those federal review committees, I know I can volunteer to sit on one, but the grant review committees are thinking, why would we put any money into local foods in Iowa? It's a waste of money. It's good money after bad or whatever. I think that we had a 140-mile-an-hour inland hurricane last year that none of you have heard about, because it didn't make the news like the wildfires did, because wealthy people's homes didn't get burned down. I don't know what, but and it took the roofs off of apartment buildings of immigrants in Cedar Rapids that made them look like dollhouses. And that's climate change, folks. But to get the money to help those folks, you had to know where to find it as a nonprofit. I guess I'd like to throw out this one provocative statement. I want my government back. I want federal employees who do this research. I want federal employees who are experts in climate change to come out and make things work. I want federal workers who are construction workers rebuilding our homes in a way that are climate resilient. I want a federal government that has to stand up to and abide by federal anti-discrimination laws. Do this work instead of 1,000 points of light and 1 million nonprofits scraping together the dollars they can and fighting with each other over those dollars. That have to do all this organizing to get a few scraps to do the right thing. And I know that's provocative, but I think it's time that we start talking about big government being a good thing that can solve our problems if it's truly accountable to the people. So I just wanted to put that out there, because then we're not arguing about, a lot of these things. And then our government pays for the research at our institutions like it used to, instead of private corporations paying for for secret PhD defenses like they happen here, that are closed to the public, even though I paid for the roof over the head of that institution. I guess I just want to throw it out there.
Brianna, I wanted to jump in here and say a couple things here before. I know where I was in, but we started, at least from my perspective, we started this idea about sovereignty and food sovereignty. And so I just sort of want to share at least 6 things I think that people can do if they want to work with us. I think we have to look at agricultural policy again and look at the Farm Bill travel provisions. I think we do need to educate how to strengthen our federal agricultural programs in Indian country. I think we need a land policy that strengthens our own how we can and should manage land and tribal lands from our perspective. I think we need to look at water and water policy and advancing the water rights settlements, provide technical assistance where needed. Again, we need federal laws and policies and funding that needs to strengthen our own water management. Emily mentioned an idea about tribal governance, tribal governments. I think we do need to think about how the role of our tribal governments and how they may not meet our needs now, but what can we do to enhance those? I do think we need protections from our traditional ecological knowledge. What do we do how do we strengthen our native farmers and ranchers? We have an important part of that. Our economy is our farmers and ranchers, so we need to think about how we support them through the Keeps Eagle settlement and some of those other programs that are happening there that support us. And finally, I would say again how this started with climate action policy. I think we still have a need to educate our leadership in Washington, D.C. about the importance of tribal needs and priorities and how that funding can come together. So I wanted to say that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much. I think we'll have to wrap up shortly, but did anyone have final points on provocative statements or otherwise to share with our audience?
I'll just say, speaking as a federal employee here, I agree, Susan, wholeheartedly there. We took a big hit. We lost a lot of good people. And so now we're trying to refill the ranks, if you will, who can work on climate change issues among many, many others across the federal. So I definitely think there's a lot of people that would agree with that statement out there and want to do more and hope to do more in the future.
Well, thank you all so much for your time and sharing some thoughts about climate, food, and culture with us today. I'm going to turn it over to Amber Campbell, who's with the USDA, and she has some final discussant thoughts after listening to you all speak today.
Great. Thank you so much, Bree. And thank you to all of our panelists. This has been a really great, yet another great webinar in the series. I kind of want to step back and think about the first 2 as well. So we've gone through all 3 of these webinars, and we had our first one on the sociocultural aspects of food and culture, or of food and climate change. We had another one on fisheries, and then we have this third one, which is really practitioner focused. And some themes have been coming out over and over throughout this whole series. And there are some that were really kind of stuck out to me today. And so today, the thing that really stuck out to me was this idea of the distinction between the local nuanced understanding from actually working with people and what the needs are and what is happening, and how that gives you a really great perspective, but how that there is a disconnect between that and that sort of generalized information that we need in terms of the federal government enacting any sort of policy, and how do we bridge that gap. And so I think, to me, that was kind of the theme that kept coming up in my head, is how do we bridge that divide? And then thinking about the sort of differential access to resources and power along that whole spectrum, and how do we get from one to the other? So differential access to land, differential access to the resources needed to protect yourself from what's happening in that environment, to the power needed to change the way that things are, and to even access the funding that could help you get there. And how do we get people those resources. And then the other thing that really came up to me was this idea of the people that we're doing research on or to, which I think is kind of glaring in the idea of that we're doing research on or to people as opposed to helping people achieve their own goals and through that participatory action research. Like, how do we get to a system where we are collaborating with other individuals as equal human beings with equally valid knowledge bases? And how do we integrate all of our knowledges in order to achieve that goal that we're all striving for of an equitable, just food system? So I think, yeah, I think that was kind of like those are the things that really came out to me today in terms of how does this come out in terms of actual practice in our agricultural system. So with that, I think I want to thank everyone for attending all of these webinars, and especially to thank the Planning Committee, Bree Farber, Emily Brooks, Ariella Zeikerman, myself, Austin Sheets, and a special thanks to Tia Biggs from the USGCRP, Kelsey Combres-Friedman from NOAA, Gia Lee from the World Bank, who was formerly of EPA, and the NOAA Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program, also known as RESA, for their support of our program. Right. Oh, and also, I think Austin is going to be sending out the recordings of all of the webinars to everyone who registered in the next couple of days.